Alrighty. Welcome to NycosRPG. I'm Jonathan Alvin, your host, and this week we are doing The Monster Shop. This is going to be an ongoing series of videos specifically introducing new monsters to you for use in your games from the world of Nykos. The mechanism will be set up and demonstrated within the Nykos mechanism, but realize that all Nykos numbers are percentage based and therefore easily converted to whatever mechanism you're currently using, whether it be a D20, D10, D6 system. This series is part of NycosRPG, and if you haven't yet and you like our content, make sure you subscribe. If you are here on Twitch, realize the subscription will mean no commercials. You'll be able to see this commercial free by subscribing. In the case of those of you on YouTube, your subscription is greatly appreciated, and by subscribing, liking, and commenting, you help to promote the property on YouTube and keep it a daily channel. So today we're going to be introducing this concept in the Monster Shop. I will be presenting a certain creature from the world of Nykos. I will be using the player persona profile, which is available at NycosRPG.com. Hopefully these will be useful enough that we will do these on an ongoing basis, and each episode will be a new being, and it will be done in alphabetical order from A through Z, and 26 creatures in, say, 12 or 13 episodes, something like that. That's our intention anyway. But by giving you an alphabetical stretch, you also will have a framework for building your own Enchiridion. Aethera are found generally in the wide open spaces. They are rather solitary beings. They are a form of Aven, so they are birds, if you will, and in some cases they are analogous to an owl-like species. They tend to be nocturnal. They tend to be fairly wide-ranging, which is surprising for a creature that can operate in the darkness of the night sky. But the Aethera do therefore have an operating mechanism that you won't find in most of the Aven population, and that is a form of aural sonar. So the Aethera give out a clicking, piercing cry, high-pitched, little tiny bursts of sound, and these are then used for echolocation compared to their current location in flight with any food supply and or threats that might exist, not to mention obstacles. So this clicking sound that is associated with the Aethera is called the pulse of the night, and it generally is fairly rhythmic at about half-second bursts, as the Aven species itself has an operating speed of a little over double move rate as far as ground forces. It has to pulse fairly often to be able to do the comparative work inside of its own head to calculate its distance from target, distance from obstacles and such. With that, you notice I didn't put any images up here, and I won't be putting images up for the Enchiridion until I get such time as players demand it and want to start providing me with graphic art. But in this point, we're operating in the theater of the mind, which is generally where the roleplay games that I run operate, which is to say, as I'm describing it, you have to be getting a mental picture of what you would think the Aethera looks like. We even haven't talked about its coloring, its plumage, its physical shape, size, or dimension. So at this point, the Aethera could be as big as a small aircraft and could be as small as a hummingbird. We really don't know. But so the utilization of the Aethera as a creature within the world of Nykos is not only as a insectoid night, a hunter of insects at night, which is the classic position that owl would take. But the Aethera are also inerrant navigators, and they've been known to travel dozens of miles in an evening and be able to find their way home within a reasonable amount of time. Pardon me. With, therefore, the idea they are an inerrant hunter and they eat insects, that gives you a kind of a concept of the relative size of the Aethera. Although you wouldn't necessarily be able to see them, even though you can pick out the sound of them flying through the nights, they do have darker underbellies and lighter plumage from above. And that might be particularly surprising, because you would think that they would be, as most birds, lighter on the underside and darker on the upper side. But since they operate at night, the color scheme is somewhat reversed. And Aethera feathers are known to be particularly liked by members of the Raven clan, for example. So although the Aethera is not a raven, often Raven clan members will use Aethera tail feathers in their hats and such, as they are a deep black feather. Interesting note, the tail feathers of the Aethera are actually bicolor, which means that with a turn of the feather, it goes from being standard black to an ash gray. And this is important because many night hunters are optic hunters, and therefore are going off of the physical shape of the targets they're pursuing. And therefore the Aethera, because the Aethera at night are being hunted, they tend to fly side-to-side patterns, keeping their specific size and such somewhat of a limited scope. Not, I suppose, unlike the concept of an aircraft using stealth technology, because the Aethera is reducing its signature by bringing its wings in and therefore covering the body with those lighter colored feathers for the majority of its forward movement, and then re-expanding the wings to catch the air, and therefore it almost seems like it's grabbing air on each flight pass. So its wings actually do almost like an oar-like pattern in the air. Now this is important also because, as you may recall, in the world of Nykos, aquatic beings are also airborne beings by the nature of the oceans of Nykos. So therefore, many of the predators that might hunt an Aethera might actually be aquatic beings, which means not necessarily fast but stealthy. So again, the size and speed of the Aethera really is important to keep track of how its survivability goes. And so therefore the Aethera are often used as emblems of organizations that are of a covert nature. So kingdoms will have either etheric units, which means they are stealth-like units, but they use the term Aethera to explain that naming structure, or they actually use the bird as their emblem. Suggestive of course, very efficient night operators. Alrighty, so now the final thing that we haven't really talked about yet is the size of an Aethera. The Aethera as an actual bird's size varies only by region and food supply. The more frequent tropical Aethera are larger. The less sizable, the smaller northern Aethera are found in dense forests. Again, you would think that'd be a difficult place for such a small flyer to operate, but the wing beat process, as I said, provides them with a pretty small signature as they're moving through the air, and so the wing beat speed of a northern Aethera is nearly triple that of the larger, more overt hunters of the South. So, just a quick recap. The Aethera, used as a emblem by covert operations around the world of Nykos, is a dark and light Aven creature, bird, very owl-like in terms of its visual features, large eyes for operating in the evening, and despite that, they also use aural sonar location, so they can find their way around by sound. And they are identified by their high-pitched clicking sound, tiny chirps at roughly half-second bursts to keep themselves airborne. The speed of the clicks actually does increase when they are in more congested areas, as they need more rapid and more detailed information of the area in which they are flying. Therefore, a group that is concerned about operations of Aethera in an area might want to consider low pitch sounds in irregular bursts as a way of foiling the Aethera's hunting mechanism, and therefore prevent the Aethera from operating in the nearby vicinity to that low booming sound. Another episode we'll talk about the creature that is the natural threat to the Aethera, but let's go with what we have for now. So, now we've talked about the mechanics. We talked about the description of the Aethera, its operating theater. Let's talk a little bit about its biosphere, its operational location. So, the Aethera, as I've said, are insect hunters and are tentatively flyers. Therefore, the majority of the prey that they hunt are also airborne and insectoid. So they do tend to operate, surprisingly, in areas with fairly high amounts of ambient light. The insects are far easier to hunt when you can do so with your optics rather than with your aural sensitivity, and so therefore, surprisingly, the Aethera will operate with less sound in brightly lit areas and more sound in darker areas. Therefore, they're much more pronounced in places where the dark is providing their cover, whereas in the areas where they are not, they do move with a swiftness that makes them very hard to track, even if they are operating completely silent, even if they're not operating silently. Their clicking sound, therefore, would be technically reduced. Therefore, the frequency of the clicks, therefore, changes the ability to identify specifically where they are. So let's now talk about the. We're talking about their biosphere. So they operate in highly populated areas, generally with a high insect population, generally with a high airborne insect population. So areas of the deep jungles where there are considerable numbers of mosquitoes and gnats and other swarming flying creatures are the natural prey of the Aethera. And it is known that people have semi-domesticated the Aethera in certain areas and then utilize the Aethera to keep their living areas fairly clear of these annoying and potentially disease-ridden insects. There are legends or rumors that there may be giant Aethera in the darkest parts of the jungles, especially when you go into the furthest southern portions of Groenland, such as the area around Cenobia, where the Aethera got its name. They were originally identified by settlers who had come to the area around what is now Tenerife in the time periods before the Thakran Empire finally collapsed. This is several generations ago. But The Aethera, as I've said, are generally solitary hunters, but they ironically do tend to nest in proximity to each other, although discovering an Aethera nest is quite an accomplishment, because they tend to do so on high and virtually inaccessible cliff faces and such, and they use a mud dauber kind of approach, although it may be that they are actually conveying some form of elemental magic, in that the nests are actually, they seem to be formed out of the earth itself, but there's no sign of them actually bringing the soil from the surface up to that location, but rather it seems that the bird type actually can manipulate the soils to create their small caverns. These little cavelets aren't much bigger than a classic spheroid football, whether you're talking about Eastern or American, but the concept of it being about that mechanical size gives a little bit of a range for the nests. They are generally in pairs, although multiplicities of families have been known to, especially under stressful situations or when they are overpopulated, living in larger communal nests. All right, so now we've covered that, let's actually look at the numbers, shall we? So in the first case of the brilliance of these beings, as they are of animal intellect, generally we're going to keep their numbers in somewhere between the 20 and 25 range, although that doesn't necessarily indicate how truly clever they are. They have been known to seem to work in a pack or a flight, and even in the worst of seasons they will actually flock, in which case woe to any who are airborne in their area, because they are swift, agile, and rather aggressive when they're on the hunt. The core of their brilliance, therefore, is a 4. So if they are trying to get into or out of their nests, sometimes they have difficulty because of their lacked brilliance. Their cognizance, which is their awareness, is rather, I guess it would be unsurprisingly high, in that they have a cognizance in the same range as many mortal beings, at roughly a 40 value, which gives them an 8 in the core for that. Now notice that these numbers can be converted to Dungeons and Dragons numbers at the rudimentary level by cutting these numbers in half. So even though we are working on a percentage-based system, the Nykos mechanism allows for a double up, double down mechanism. That is to say, the creatures can get a partial success when they roll their cognizance value, or their numeric value, up to double the actual base value, and they can get a wild success, or fundamentally the equivalent of a critical, if they roll double down, which would be half of that value. So, for example, in this case, the cognizance of an Aethera is high enough that even if you rolled 80 on your percentage dice, with the double up, that would be considered a partial success. So it's very difficult for them not to be aware of what's going on around them. In other words, it's kind of hard to surprise an Aethera. As far as their grace, although grace is not directly related to your velocity across the ground, I'm going to still give them a grace value that also is fairly high. Mainly because agility and turning on a dime is pretty high, so that they're agile and they are aware, so to speak, of what they are doing. When it comes to their presence, because they're literally trying to not be noticed, is they will appear, especially in small groups, to be rather timid. So I'm only going to provide them with a individual 15. Now, in the case of working as a flock, there would be a separate number for the flock. We'll deal with that in a later episode as we talk about, that'll be actually in the marks. We'll get to that in a bit. And therefore it means that their presence score is only going to be a 3. So individually they're not very intimidating, they're not very brave, they're not very, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but they don't stand out. You might not even notice them if they were sitting on a branch near you. They just simply be a rather light-colored bird with their wings folded. Their resilience, however, is modest, so we will set that at 25. Oops. Wrong space. And therefore, their core will be at 5. But when it comes to resolve, they are rather determined beings. And it's hard to drive one away. If it's on the hunt and you have its food supply, it will, even a single one of them will hold its own and not be driven away. It takes, when they're with their herd, forget about it. And so if we were to do the actual numbers on this, 60, 100, 140, 175, it'd be around a 33. We're going to go give it a little bit higher. We're going to give them a foundational value of 35. Because they are pretty ruddy, tough birds as far as physically being able to take even the predatory wiles of other creatures. To take down an individual Etheria is rather tough work for even hunting birds. So now we're going to talk about the marks. And the first one is the tendency to flock. Let's see if I can get that to fit better. Let's go one more. All right. So the tendency to flock means that when you run into one Aethera, there are others around. We're going to give that mark value because it's going to be based on their presence. I'm only going to give them the 30. That means that if you run into them, more than likely you're going to run into at least some more. And for the possibility of there being a rather large flock is pretty slim at 15% because it would be the double down. The advantage of a flocked group is that it will get the secondary function, which is... I guess what you would call that is superiority complex. And what that means is with the group, they are much more brave than they are when they are not. So we'll give them superiority complex. The third thing they would have is, we've already talked about it before, inerrant flight. Oops. which means that they don't tend to get lost. This is based on their cognizance, so therefore it would be at a 40. I should actually change this to be off of their resolve. There we go. So for clarity, what I did is I made the tendency to flock actually operate off of their presence, which means that the odds of them flocking are relatively small at roughly 7% or less, but they will have all the way up to a 30% chance. So it's likely that if you see one, there's more around. And then their superiority complex is associated with their resolve, so that looks like even one of them would be thinking that, you know, its thought process would be that it could probably take its opponent. Generally, you only need about 1, 2, or 3 marks to make a creature specifically unique. These 3 are generic enough that you could have more than one type of a theory. You might have a day version, and therefore the description will change, the coloration will change, and that kind of thing. But you could have other flying beings that fit into these. So the rest of the marks you would have would be the expected ones, which would be just, well, you've already said inerrant flight, so you don't have to, well, should be make that inerrant navigation. Oops. Okay. So therefore we give them flight. Why are you doing that? That's interesting. Why is it doing that? There we go. You have no idea what that was. Flight meaning it can go airborne. Let's see. We talked about it having Ombalor, which means it has earth elemental magic. That would be on its resolve. 35. Its flight would be based on its grace, so that would be a 40. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so one more. No. Yep. Both of these are still in the wrong size. That's lovely. Same with this one. character 20. Okay. What would be the final? Well, we already talked about it, so I'll go ahead and give it official. And its camouflage would be based on its coloration, which would be its presence, but it also is camouflaged by its ability to maintain stillness. So I'm going to give that a resolve. So. Alrighty, so there you have the mechanics for it. The Aethera are, they have the tendency to flock, so that they don't get together often, but if they do, there are going to be a considerable number of them. Once you've rolled for one of them, there's a possibility of each of them having an even larger group with them, so therefore it can get ridiculous if you get really fortunate on the die rolls. They have a superiority complex, so once there are a group of them in the area, they basically dominate the zone. They have natural navigation, which means they can go from location to location over surprisingly long distances and still return home. They have flight, of course. They have amba lore, which means they build their nests into the soil. And then they have the ability to camouflage either by being perfectly still or by their flight maneuvering, which we talked about earlier. So that is what an Aethera is in terms of numbers. Now, what you use it for, of course, you can use this a dozen different ways. You can call it what you want to because it's going to be happening in your world. But in the theater of the mind, we now both have this mental picture. Now, to carry forward the last thing that I said previously, when I said the various guilds will use the feathers to represent the Aethera, the reason for doing so is when they are marking themselves to be discovered, they'll turn the black feather up, and when they are trying to pass as unnoticeable, they'll turn the feather back to the gray side, the lighter side, the less noticeable side. So now you've got an idea of what the Aethera are, and this is also, notice that we've only used one page of the profile. If you were going to build, say, a communal nest of the Aethera, perhaps as a encounter location, there might be a lot more to it. There might be special versions of the species that have, for example, mockingbird communication. So you might add a new alternate mark for the species. You can actually extend beyond the primary 6 if it was something that was particularly notable for a sizable encounter. If you were going to have, for example, a sec-gen Aethera, then the person would have that individual would have a full persona sheet. And that's an interesting thing that I might actually imagine seeing in games groups. Now that I've described them, my players, once they see this, will come back to me going, "Hey, Jonathan, I want to play an Aethera sec-gen." So we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, let me bring back our header and cap out our form for today. This has been NycosRPG's Monster Shop episode 0.1. This has been the test of the Monster Shop portion of NycosRPG's Game Master's Toolbox. I want to thank you for being here and being a part of the show. If you like what you see, make sure you subscribe. If you subscribe here on Twitch, that means no commercials. And that's of great value to quite a few of the persons that I know that watch Twitch. They'd like to not have to deal with all those commercials. On the other hand, if you're watching this and you're on YouTube, why don't you go ahead and subscribe and leave me a comment. Let me know what you think of it. How would you use the Aethera in your campaign? Do you see some, for example, alternate colorations for, say, a coastal version or maybe a deep forest version. I mean, there's a lot of room for expansion and creativity, and I'd love to hear your input. In the meantime, I want to thank you again for being here and being part of the episode, and hope to see you. And it's one of my favorites that have come up recently. Actually, the locale of this creature in particular is on the unnamed southern continent of Nykos, and they are known as Brever. Roughly the size of a brown bear, the Brever are extremely large, semi-aquatic mammals. They work wood as their namesake beavers would, but with their bear size, the name Brever fits them a little bit better. They are bear beavers, so Brevers. The coat and pelt of a Brever is optimal for making blankets and clothing, so they are hunted. However, they are also a communal, and like the Aethera that we mentioned before, are smarter than your average bear beaver. So they actually are as often likely to trade with an adventuring group as they are to fear them and run for the high hills. So if you can make a trade negotiation with Brevers, you're well ahead, because they also, in addition to their value as a pelt, they are also particularly astute at cutting down and, at least initially, prepping timbers. And thus far, they have not been hyper aggressive. But then again, the player group has found itself at a disadvantage, not speaking any of the local tongues until this last week. So, the Brever as a species, as I was describing, occupy the southern temperate zone. None of these have yet been brought back to the northern continent, as they were literally just discovered last week. And I know this is a spoiler, so those of you who are following the world of Nykos, the Nykos Unknown News Network Nightly News will have an update on the Brevers next week. But the species is indigenous to the temperate zones of the southern continent, and we have not yet come up with a name for that. So while it will be more than likely afforded to the players of the group that discovered the continent, you still have an opportunity to be a part of that. So if you have not yet considered it, you might want to join our Patreon program and become a member of the Saturday adventuring group known as the Voyages of the Arkan Eye. It's the vessel that is the first to sail to the southern continent, and they have not yet established a name for the continent. And you could actually be a part of Nykos by becoming a member of that crew and helping to not only name beings like the Brevers, but also to name the nation, and perhaps have a foundation or community or a settlement named after yourself in the world of Nykos. Just throwing that out there. All right, so back to the Brevers. Individual units, as I said, individual beings are about the size of a brown bear. Therefore, their young are analogous to the size of bear cubs, with, of course, the marked difference that they have a large flattened tail. And they are rather rowdy in their youth. So you will quite often hear a mad splashing going on if there is a small colony of younger breavers working around a water supply, which of course they will be always in close proximity to that. Surprisingly, they don't tend to build complete dams across even small streams, as they seem to be intuitively associated with the elemental plane of Ava, which we'll be able to explain here in a moment when we do talk about their marks. Because of their affinity for the elementals, they do seem to be able to transition from being truly mammalian to being, at least at some point for extended periods of time, a form of amphibian. And whether this is just extremely good regimentation, whether they've discovered ways to create pockets of air beneath the waves, no one's really certain because they're so new. So there's a lot of range of discovery that might be found about the breavers. We have not actually yet noted and experienced a breaver pelt yet, but that's coming, and the dangers that might mean to their population over the long term might become problematic in the future because their value will be so high. So let's get to their numbers, shall we? Oh no, it's about its environment. So they are herbivores. They will be opportunistic eaters if they have to, but they generally tend to be herbivores, and they particularly like the greeneries of the high tops of trees and such. So they do often take down entire timbers, even if it's not for their own personal use. So they are known to have made nonverbal trades with other species, and in particular the Hrosa have a good relationship with a nearby pod of breavers. Their communal lifestyle is such that the males and females work collectively to care for the young, and so it's hard to determine a male from a female as they work. They're roughly the same size, and they do act communally in the defense of the nest, so to speak. The colonies tend to stay below 15 or 20, including the young, and so when the population gets closer to the top, generally there'll be a bit of a alpha identification process wherein they will actually engage with their own kind in not necessarily playful, but not non-lethal conflict, where they will drive off any of the younger would-be suitors, and then the males have to go and basically build their own new families. And so therefore they are not found too far apart. Even the rather aggressive males won't be found too far from the other pods of breavers, as they will look for breaver. Wow, there you go. The first Nycosian tongue twister. Breaver beater. Breaver breeder beavers. There we go. Yes. So they will be a challenge to discover. We'll go more into that when we get to the threats to the ecology, but we're not yet there in the story, so we really can't talk too much about that. Because of their size and the amount of lumber that they can clear, they tend to live in extremely verdant areas only, and do tend to self-regulate their population. So as the tree count comes down, so do the number of young that they breed. So, alrighty, so let's go to their numbers. Looking at the brilliance of looking at the brilliance of a breaver They are pretty resourceful, so I'm going to give them a 35. That seems fairly high, but some of them are known to pick up at least the equivalent of a sign language of sorts. They do have, on both their forelegs and their hind legs, they do have opposable thumb-like appendages, and so therefore they are known to utilize forms of chronomy, sign language, when dealing with trade. And the older they are, the more likely they have some form of this communication. Unfortunately, they don't have as great of eyesight as you might expect. Because they work communally, they don't have to have particularly good eyesight, and so their cognizance is going to be smaller. That also is why they tend to identify and communicate with each other through slapping their tails on the water and in a certain rhythm based on their particular pod. They are pretty swift in the water, and although, as we've said before, grace does not directly equate to move rate, nonetheless, the agility, the grace of the breavers is moderately high. So we're going to leave that at roughly a 30. And if you notice, I'm walking through these with great intention. I'm actually picking the numbers. And this is what I would recommend when you're dealing with creating monsters on your own. When you are building the monster, have a pretty good picture of what you imagine it will be like in action, and therefore give it numbers that make that kind of sense. So, for example, breavers, by their very ponderous size, are going to tend to have a fairly decent presence, relatively speaking. So I'm going to provide that at a 25 as well. That means that generally one will stand up for itself. Now we're going to talk about pack mentality and things like that here in a second when we talk about their marks. In terms of resilience, they are hardy beings, being as big as they are. So I'm going to give that a 40. It also means that they're pretty hard to drive off if you got one that's pissed off about something. So there we go. Their resolve is even higher than the average bear, so to speak. So I'm going to give them a 45 in resolve. This gives them a 9. And then finally, foundation, 35. That's 60, 90. Somewhere north of 30, so I'm going to leave it 35. Alrighty, so these numbers give it a fairly decent range. Realize that even if they are considered to be non-sentient, they do have a foundation of 7, so they can have developed several different skills, including, for example, perhaps some fighting strategies that the entire pod will use. So there's a lot of options there. Now, when we're talking about the marks of the beings, we need to talk about the things that clearly define them. And the first thing they're going to be is they're going to have I'm going to call it timbercraft. Why is it doing this again? Because I wasn't in the box. Aha. This basically means that they're going to be able to work their way through issues of which branch to cut and all of that. So I'm going to give that to their brilliance. Hang on just a second. Not good. Alrighty, so they're be pretty clever about cutting down the trees they want to cut down. Next, I'm going to put down swimming. Oh, I'm doing it again. it doing that? Insert. Wow, what is going on? Swimming. That's not a good skill. Pardon me. As I mentioned, they've got that connection with the NATO, so they're going to have NATO. I think is what I called it last time. So they have an affinity for the water element. And therefore they can stay underwater for extended periods of time utilizing their NATO lore. They got timbercraft, and then they've got swimming. I'm going to. Oops. To make this more clear, I'm going to be switching this to. I'm also going to give them the skill of chronomy. Which is sign language or sign language. Put that under the form of trade. That's going to be based on their brilliance. So they are pretty clever. So 35. NATO lore is going to be on their resolve. Which means they can learn even more than what they start with. We'll go more into that in a bit. Swimming would be against their resilience. And timber gnawing would be against their resilience. Resolve. I guess it'd be against their grace. Alrighty, so notice I've given them an extra skill compared to the 3 that I say are average. Whenever you have a creature that is sizable, you might want to give it additional marks. In this case, do I want to give it? I'm not going to give it. I've already got swimming, so. They are not bipeds by any stretch, so they're just quadrupedal form. Why is it doing that? Hide his armor. make it uniform. All right. So, quick recap of the Brever. Oops. The Brever is a quadrupedal fur-covered being that is particularly suited for operating in water, and its attributes mean that it's good at cutting down trees, and its suited life food source are the tree tops, so they are experts at basically clearing timber, and their affinity for doing so means that they also have developed the capacity for at least rudimentary trade. We don't necessarily have them speaking a particular language, but they do have this concept of using sign language or chronomy to carry messages into other people's minds through trade processes. Their numbers as are located here are built using the Nykos mechanism. Numerically, they are percentage based. If you were going to convert them, say, to a traditional Dungeons and Dragons mechanism, all you really need to do would be cut them in half to come up with their numeric equivalent, adjusting as necessary to suit the purpose. But therefore, these numbers can be used in generating your traditional stat block if you so desired. But the Brever concept as a Nycosian being uses the percentage-based system, and the core is the utilization value for if it wants to learn, pick up a new skill, and how long it takes for it to learn. So therefore, they are not, as astute as a sentient being species, and they certainly aren't a playable race, so to speak. So now we've had today both the Aethera and the Brevers, so that's been two that we've done today, and those will be cut down to make individual episodes for the YouTubes, so to speak. And so let's go through our formal steps here. If you like what you're seeing, go ahead and subscribe to the Twitch channel. Remember that if you subscribe on Twitch, one of the benefits is you get to watch them commercial free. And if there is ever a problem with that, make sure you let me know. If you're subscribed, you shouldn't be seeing any commercials any longer on Twitch. That does not apply to the YouTubes. So if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to help maintain this as a daily channel. Your comments and feedback are greatly appreciated and really help this show to grow our audience. Hello, everybody, and welcome to NycosRPG. I'm Jonathan Albin, your host, and today we are doing... I almost got it figured out. Blah, 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 blah.